29th May, 1940, Dunkirk's beaches. A German shell obliterates the command post's radio mast at 14:17 hours. Communications to Dover severed. 338,000 men trapped. No orders. No evacuation coordination. No hope. Then Lance Corporal Albert Bertie Marsh pulled a pencil from his breast pocket, lashed it to shrapnel-twisted copper wire with bootlace, and pointed it at England. What happened next defied every principle of radio engineering and changed the course of the war. The morning of 29th of May 1940 began with the acrid stench of burning oil hanging over Dunkirk harbour like a funeral shroud. At 06:42 hours precisely, Lance Corporal Albert Marsh, aged 23, from Bromley, Kent, sat hunched inside a sandbagged command post 400 yards from the beach, adjusting frequencies on a Type 11 wireless set whose valves glowed amber in the gloom. The temperature inside measured 11 degrees despite 7 men crowded into 12 square feet. Outside, the persistent drizzle that had plagued northern France for 3 days continued, turning the surrounding dunes into glutinous grey mud that sucked boots from feet and swallowed equipment. Bertie Marsh was no career soldier. 18 months prior, he'd been a junior clerk at the Woolwich Arsenal, filing requisition forms and drinking tea with precisely 2 sugars. His knowledge of radio came from a childhood fascination with crystal sets, assembled from wire, scavenged from his father's electrical shop. When conscription notices arrived in January 1939, Bertie mentioned wireless during his interview. By September, he wore Royal Corps of Signals flashes and understood Morse code faster than most men read English. The strategic situation was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions had shattered French and British defensive lines with methodical efficiency. 400,000 Allied troops now compressed into a shrinking perimeter around Dunkirk, their backs to the channel, artillery hammering them from 3 sides. German Stukas screamed overhead at intervals, precisely calculated to maximize psychological terror. The Luftwaffe had already destroyed Dunkirk's harbour infrastructure. Twisted cranes jutted from the water like skeletal fingers. Communications represented the sole lifeline, preventing total collapse. Every 15 minutes, Bertie transmitted situation reports to Dover. Troop concentrations, casualty figures, ammunition states, evacuation progress. These messages coordinated the improvised flotilla of destroyers, minesweepers, fishing boats, and pleasure craft, attempting Operation Dynamo. The desperate evacuation, Churchill's staff privately considered impossible. Without radio contact, Dover operated blind. Captains couldn't know where troops gathered, which beaches remained accessible, whether German artillery controlled specific sectors. Bertie's wireless set, its antenna mast a 20-foot steel pole guyed to sandbags, represented the primary link between 338,000 men and survival. The vulnerability was obvious. The antenna's height made it a landmark. German artillery observers used it for ranging. Twice already that morning, shells had landed within 50 yards, showering the command post with sand and shrapnel. Major Thornton, the signals officer, a veteran of the Great War who still bore French mud under his fingernails despite 20 years, had grimly observed, "They're walking rounds toward us, Marsh, methodical buggers." At 14:17 hours, the inevitable occurred. Bertie was mid-transmission. Sitrep follows stop, sector able now under heavy mortaring, stop casualties, mounting, stop request. When the 105mm shell struck the antenna mast directly, the concussion lifted Bertie bodily and slammed him against sandbags. His ears screamed with sudden deafness. Dust and cordite smoke choked vision. When clarity returned 15 seconds later, the mast lay in 3 pieces, twisted metal smoking in the rain. The wireless set's valves had survived, protected by Bertie's body, but the copper feed line hung limp, severed 6 inches from the set. Major Thornton appeared through the smoke, blood trickling from his nose. "Marsh, status!" His voice seemed distant, muffled by Bertie's traumatized hearing. Bertie examined the damage with methodical precision. his hands steady despite adrenaline flooding his system. The wireless set functioned, valves intact, power supply operational. But without an antenna to radiate electromagnetic waves, it was useless as a brick. The spare mast, stored horizontally outside the bunker, lay buried under collapsed sandbag revetments, probably broken. The implications cascaded. Communications to Dover, severed. Evacuation coordination, impossible. Thousands of troops on the beaches, waiting for boats that wouldn't know where to come. German artillery, advancing methodically, unimpeded by naval counterfire that required radio-directed spotting. The perimeter would collapse within hours without coordination. Major Thornton understood instantly. How long to repair? Bertie assessed the shattered mast. 6 hours minimum, sir. Need to excavate the spare, splice feed lines, re-guy the whole assembly, assuming the spare mast isn't destroyed. We don't have 6 bloody hours, Marsh. We don't have 60 minutes. Thornton's voice carried the flat certainty of a man calculating deaths. Without comms, Dover can't coordinate evacuation. The boats will scatter. Troops will bunch up where Jerry can slaughter them. He paused, staring at the smoking wreckage. Fix it. I don't care how. Fix it now. The order was impossible. Every manual, every training lecture, every principle of radio engineering required a proper antenna. Vertical conductor, precise length calculated to wavelength, elevated above ground to maximize radiation. Bertie possessed none of these. The twisted copper feed line, salvaged from the wreckage, measured perhaps 8 feet, insufficient for efficient transmission on their frequency. The ground, waterlogged by 3 days' rain, would absorb most radiated energy. Theory predicted failure. But Bertie Marsh, son of a Bromley electrician, possessor of stubborn working-class pragmatism that considered impossible merely difficult, refused to accept death as inevitable. He knelt in the mud beside the wireless set, rain soaking through his battle dress, and began improvising with materials at hand. 6 feet of twisted copper wire salvaged from the destroyed mast, still warm from the explosion, a length of bootlace from his spare boots. And cracked against the likelihood of such desperation, a standard-issue HB pencil retrieved from his breast pocket, miraculously unbroken despite the blast. The command post, half buried in a dune 400 yards inland from Dunkirk's eastern beach, measured 8 feet by 12, walls constructed from sandbags filled with sand so wet they wept continuously, creating rivulets that pooled in the dugout floor. 7 men occupied this miserable space. Major Thornton coordinating sectors, 2 runners waiting for messages, a map clerk updating positions with graphite that smeared in the humidity, a medical orderly treating shrapnel wounds with dwindling supplies, and Bertie Marsh hunched over his Type 11 wireless set, attempting to violate every principle of electromagnetic theory. The environmental conditions were spectacularly hostile. Temperature inside the dugout fluctuated between 9 degrees C and 13 degrees C, depending on how many men breathed in the enclosed space. Outside, the rain, that relentless northern French rain that had turned roads to quagmires and made bivouacking a sodden nightmare, continued its monotonous assault. The ground, saturated beyond capacity, conducted electricity poorly, precisely the opposite of what Bertie needed for effective antenna operation. Overhead, German artillery maintained systematic bombardment. Every 7 to 12 minutes, shells impacted within 200 yards. Closer strikes shook dust from sandbag walls and made Bertie's hands tremble despite determined effort to keep them steady. The wireless set itself represented pre-war technology already obsolescent, thermionic valves that required careful tuning, a power supply dependent on temperamental batteries recharged by a petrol generator 50 yards distant, controls calibrated in units that required mental arithmetic to convert to frequencies. Under ideal conditions, elevated antenna, dry ground, stable power, the Type 11 could transmit 50 miles reliably. Dunkirk to Dover measured 39 miles across the channel. Theoretically achievable, But nothing about their situation resembled ideal conditions. Bertie's materials consisted of salvaged wreckage. The copper wire, recovered from the destroyed antenna mast, measured 6 feet 3 inches. He'd measured it twice with a tape from his kit, because precision mattered even when improvising. The wire was twisted, kinked where shrapnel had struck it, oxidized green in places from exposure to salt air. Electrical theory predicted such imperfections would create impedance mismatches, reflecting transmitted energy back into the wireless set rather than radiating it toward England. The bootlace, brown leather from his spare boots. He'd need to walk home in worn soles now, but that seemed a distant problem compared to immediate survival, provided the only available cordage after shrapnel severed the mast's guy lines. And the pencil. Standard War Department issue, hexagonal barrel stamped HB, 6 inches long, the graphite core theoretically conductive, but no radio manual ever suggested using writing implements as antenna components. The assembly process required improvisation bordering on absurdity. Bertie first stripped insulation from the salvaged copper wire using his clasp knife, exposing bright metal that oxidized visibly in the damp air. He connected one end to the wireless set's antenna terminal using a screw connector designed for proper coaxial cable. The twisted wire fit poorly, requiring multiple adjustments. The other end of the wire he lashed to the pencil using the bootlace, wrapping it in a spiral that would make any signals instructor weep. The pencil provided structural rigidity the wire alone lacked, allowing the entire assembly to project upward at approximately 35 degrees from horizontal. Not vertical as theory demanded, but the best angle achievable given the wire's length and the pencil's stiffness. The resulting antenna resembled something assembled by school children for a science project. Wonky, asymmetric, held together with leather bootlace, pointing toward England with more hope than engineering. Major Thornton, observing from across the dugout while coordinating mortar positions via runner, offered dry commentary characteristic of British understatement. "Marsh, that looks like something my nephew would build with an erector set. After concussion." "Yes, sir," Bertie replied, making final adjustments. "But your nephew probably wasn't being shelled by the Wehrmacht at the time, sir." "Fair point, Marsh, fair point." Thornton returned attention to his maps, but Bertie noticed the Major glancing repeatedly at the improvised antenna, calculating odds silently. Bertie understood those calculations. The antenna's length was grossly inadequate for their transmission frequency, 6.08 megahertz, requiring ideally a quarter wavelength vertical of approximately 12 meters. His contraption measured less than 3 meters total. Physics predicted most energy would be wasted, radiated in useless directions, absorbed by wet ground, reflected by impedance mismatches. Conservative estimates suggested perhaps 5% efficiency compared to the proper mast. Whether 5% would suffice to reach Dover across 39 miles of salt water remained unknowable until he attempted transmission. At 15:23 hours, Bertie keyed the transmitter. The valves glowed brighter as power flowed. He transmitted in Morse, fist tapping the key with the rhythm drilled through months of training. "Dunkirk, command, post calling Dover, stop antenna damaged repairing, stop request, confirm reception, stop." The current meter flickered, indicating power flowing into the antenna. But whether that power reached across the channel or simply heated Belgian sand remained uncertain. No response. Bertie repeated the transmission. Still nothing. He adjusted frequency slightly, compensating for the antenna's electrical characteristics. Purely intuitive adjustments based on watching the current meter's behavior. Third transmission, Dover. This is Dunkirk command, post, stop emergency traffic. Stop, please acknowledge, stop. The receiver crackled. Static, German voice traffic on adjacent frequencies, a French station broadcasting something unintelligible. Then faint but unmistakable, Dover's distinctive call sign pattern in Morse. Dunkirk command, post from Dover, stop receiving you strength 2, stop send traffic, stop, strength 2, barely readable, occasionally lost in static, but readable. The wonky pencil antenna, defying electromagnetic theory and common sense, was transmitting across the English Channel. Bertie felt something release in his chest, tension he hadn't consciously acknowledged now draining away. Major Thornton appeared at his shoulder. Working? Working, sir. They're receiving us, strength 2, weak but intelligible. Then get transmitting, Marsh. Those boats need coordinates. Oberst Heinrich Kruger, commanding the German 56th Artillery Regiment, positioned in a commandeered farmhouse 7 kilometers south of Dunkirk, studied aerial reconnaissance photographs with methodical precision at 1640 hours on 29th May. His regiment's 105mm howitzers had been systematically demolishing Allied defensive positions for 72 hours, each fire mission calculated to maximize casualties while conserving ammunition. Artillery, Kruger believed, represented warfare's purest form, mathematical application of ballistics to destroy enemies at distances where they couldn't retaliate. The day's achievements satisfied Kruger's exacting standards. 19 British vehicles destroyed, 1 ammunition dump detonated spectacularly at 11:15 hours, multiple trench systems rendered inoperative. His forward observers reported excellent results. But one target particularly pleased him, the British command post with its distinctive radio antenna mast. At 14:17 hours, Battery 3 had scored a direct hit. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the mast's destruction. Photographs showed twisted metal. The antenna array collapsed. Kruger anticipated immediate consequences. British command and control depended heavily on wireless communications. Intelligence reports consistently documented their reliance on radio coordination. Destroying their primary transmitter would sever contact with England, disrupt evacuation coordination, create paralysis at precisely the moment when Allied forces required maximum efficiency to escape. German doctrine emphasized creating systemic failure by eliminating command and control. The antenna's destruction represented textbook application of this principle. Yet at 16:55 hours, Kruger received a report that contradicted expectations. A signals intelligence unit monitoring British radio traffic reported the Dunkirk command post transmitting again. Weak signals, admittedly, barely detectable, drifting in frequency, characteristics suggesting damaged equipment. But unmistakably operational, broadcasting situation reports and evacuation coordinates to Dover. Kruger's initial response was skepticism. Verify the transmission origin, he ordered his intelligence officer, Hauptmann Dietrich, a former Berlin University physics lecturer who understood radio propagation. Confirm it's genuinely from Dunkirk, not a relay from elsewhere. Dietrich returned 30 minutes later with direction-finding bearings from 3 separate intercept stations. The triangulation was definitive. Transmissions originated from the same location as the destroyed command post, within 50 meters precision. They've restored communication somehow, Herr Oberst, Dietrich reported, confusion evident. Signal strength remains weak, perhaps 10% of normal, but they're operational. How? Kruger demanded. The mast was destroyed, confirmed by aerial reconnaissance. How do they transmit without an antenna? Dietrich, uncomfortable acknowledging engineering feats by enemies, offered tentative explanation. Perhaps a temporary field antenna, Herr Oberst, wire strung between vehicles, or an emergency mast using salvaged materials. British signals doctrine includes field expedient procedures. But Kruger, who'd studied British military procedure extensively, recognized something inconsistent with doctrine. Proper field antenna installation required hours, disassembling vehicles for metal, guying temporary masts, calculating electrical characteristics. British procedure emphasized doing things correctly per manual specifications, yet they'd restored transmission within 90 minutes of the mast's destruction. This suggested improvisation rather than doctrinal procedure, creativity rather than rigid adherence to regulations. "They're improvising," Kruger concluded, a note of reluctant respect entering his voice. "Not following proper procedure, something thrown together quickly." He paused, reconsidering the implications. Improvisation indicated desperation, yes, but also flexibility, adaptability, unwillingness to accept defeat. The British had a history of this. Dunkirk's little ships evacuating in civilian vessels, Churchill's rhetoric transforming catastrophic retreat into moral victory narrative. Kruger ordered renewed artillery attention to the command post sector, but the result frustrated him further. Despite systematic bombardment throughout the evening of 29th May and morning of 30th May, 17 separate fire missions, 203 shells expended, the British radio continued transmitting. Signal strength never improved substantially, but neither did it fail. The improvised antenna, whatever its design, survived nearby detonations that should have destroyed anything exposed. German forward observers reported frustrating reality. The British had apparently positioned their replacement antenna low to the ground, making it difficult to target directly. Without the distinctive tall mast, artillery observers couldn't identify the precise location. Shells landed close, once within 15 meters according to forward observation reports, but the antenna survived, perhaps protected by being partially below ground level or incorporated into existing earthworks. By the evening of 30th May, Kruger reviewed evacuation progress with growing concern. Despite overwhelming German advantages, superior artillery, air supremacy, strategic encirclement, the British evacuation proceeded with increasing efficiency. Dover directed vessels to specific beaches, with precision suggesting excellent intelligence. Troops assembled at optimal locations for embarkation. Naval gunfire responded to German artillery positions with accuracy indicating radio-directed spotting from shore. The evacuation, which Kruger's superiors predicted would rescue perhaps 30,000 troops before collapse, had already evacuated 72,000 in 36 hours. Kruger understood the connection. That improvised antenna, transmitting weakly but persistently from Dunkirk's shattered perimeter, coordinated an operation German doctrine predicted would collapse into chaos. The British refused to follow the script. Instead of paralysis when communications failed, they'd improvised a solution within 90 minutes. Instead of rigid adherence to proper procedure, they'd assembled something from salvaged materials that accomplished the mission despite being theoretically inadequate. Hauptmann Dietrich, monitoring continued transmissions, offered observation that captured the paradox. "Their antenna is completely outside specifications, Herr Oberst. Wrong length, insufficient height, probably constructed from inappropriate materials. Any proper signals officer would reject it as non-functional, yet it works. Not efficiently, but adequately." "Adequately wins wars, Hauptmann," Kruger replied grimly, staring at maps showing successful evacuation progress. "Perfection means nothing if you cannot adapt when perfection becomes impossible." The final vessels of Operation Dynamo departed Dunkirk's beaches at 0340 hours on 4th of June 1940. Lance Corporal Albert Marsh transmitted the final situation report at 0312 hours, his WONKY pencil antenna still functioning, despite 5 days of continuous operation under artillery bombardment that had reduced much of Dunkirk to smoking rubble. The message was brief. Final evacuation complete. Stop. 338. 226 personnel recovered. Stop. Dunkirk command post closing down. Stop. Good luck. Stop out. Dover acknowledged. Well done, Dunkirk. Stop. Safe home. Stop out. Bertie disconnected the power supply, watching the valves fade from amber to black. The improvised antenna, bootlace now frayed, pencil scored with shrapnel marks, copper wire oxidized green, had transmitted without failure for 132 continuous hours. Physics suggested it shouldn't have worked at all. Engineering calculations predicted perhaps 30-minute functionality before failure. Yet it had coordinated the largest military evacuation in history, transmitting situation reports, casualty figures, embarkation coordinates, artillery spotting corrections, and command decisions across 39 miles of salt water. With sufficient reliability, the Dover maintained continuous operational awareness. The strategic impact became apparent only with post-war analysis. Without communications, Operation Dynamo would have descended into chaos. Vessels would have arrived at beaches without troops, or troops would have concentrated where vessels couldn't reach. German artillery would have operated unopposed by naval counterfire. Evacuation estimates without radio coordination ranged from 20,000 to 50,000 troops recovered. Catastrophic loss of Britain's professional army. Instead, 338,226 men reached England, preserving military capability that would 4 years later form the nucleus of forces liberating Europe. The pencil antenna enabled this, not because it was efficient. Post-war technical assessment concluded it operated at approximately 7% efficiency compared to proper installation. Not because it followed regulations. It violated virtually every principle in signals doctrine, but because 7% efficiency proved adequate for the mission, and violation of doctrine proved irrelevant when doctrine's requirements couldn't be met. Bertie Marsh himself never considered the act particularly heroic. Interviewed by the War Office in July 1940 for a lessons learned report, he described the improvisation with characteristic understatement. "The proper mast was destroyed, sir. We needed communications. Used what materials were available. Just common sense, really." When the interviewer pressed regarding recognition, Bertie seemed uncomfortable. "Just doing the job, sir. Any wireless operator would have done the same." But any wireless operator wouldn't have done the same. Most would have concluded the task impossible without proper materials, awaited replacement equipment, followed regulations about antenna specifications. Bertie's working-class background, his childhood experience improvising crystal radios from scraps, his pragmatic refusal to accept theoretical impossibility, these shaped a response that saved an army. Major Thornton received a Distinguished Service Order for commanding the Dunkirk Signals Detachment. His citation mentioned exceptional initiative maintaining communications under severe enemy action. Bertie received a mention in dispatches. Modest recognition, a single oak leaf on his campaign ribbon. No medal, no public acknowledgement. For 47 years, his contribution remained classified, details of Operation Dynamo's communications buried in sealed files. Bertie returned to Woolwich Arsenal after demobilization in 1946, resuming his clerk position, filing requisition forms, drinking tea with 2 sugars. He married in 1947, Dorothy, a land girl he'd met during convalescence after a 1944 training accident. They had 3 children. Bertie never mentioned Dunkirk, except obliquely. Did signals work during the war? Radio operation mostly. His children knew their father had served, but understood little of what that service entailed. The story emerged publicly only in 1987, when Cabinet Office papers were declassified under 30-year rules extended for wartime documents. A researcher discovered Major Thornton's after-action report, buried in signals archives, describing emergency field antenna improvised by LCPL Marsh, using salvaged materials, including standard pencil, maintained communications throughout evacuation, despite continuous enemy action. The BBC contacted Bertie, then 70, retired to Broadstairs. The interview, broadcast on the Today programme, revealed Bertie unchanged, understated, slightly bemused by attention, more interested in discussing proper tea brewing technique than wartime service. When asked about using a pencil as antenna component, he replied with characteristic pragmatism, "Well, it was wooden, you see, so it wouldn't conduct, provided good insulation for the wire, and it was rigid, kept the whole assembly stable in the wind. Just practical engineering, really." But surely you realized you were enabling the Dunkirk evacuation, the interviewer pressed. At the time, I knew we needed communications, Bertie replied. Whether it was important beyond that particular moment, well, that's for historians to judge, isn't it? I just wanted to do my job properly. Couldn't do that without a working wireless, so I made the wireless work. Bertie died in 1995, aged 78, survived by Dorothy, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. His obituary in the Daily Telegraph, written by a military historian, concluded, LCPL Marsh exemplified the spirit of improvisation and determination that enabled Britain to survive 1940. His pencil antenna was technically inadequate but operationally sufficient, a perfect metaphor for how Britain confronted Nazi Germany with insufficient resources but adequate resolve. The pencil itself survived. Bertie had pocketed it after Dunkirk, carrying it through 5 years of war as a talisman. After his death, Dorothy donated it to the Imperial War Museum, where it remains on display. 6 inches of hexagonal wood, HB graphite core, scored by shrapnel, slightly charred at one end. The placard reads, "Pencil used as component of improvised radio antenna, Dunkirk, 1940. This ordinary object enabled extraordinary achievement, communications that coordinated evacuation of 338,226 troops. The military lessons proved enduring. Post-war signals doctrine incorporated field expedient procedures, allowing deviation from technical specifications when operational necessity demanded. The 1952 Signals Manual included a section on improvised antennas, with footnote, See Operation Dynamo After Action reports for successful historical implementation. Training emphasized not just technical correctness, but adaptability, initiative, willingness to attempt solutions despite theoretical inadequacy. Yet the deeper lesson transcended military procedure. The pencil antenna demonstrated something fundamental about British resilience. When proper solutions prove impossible, adequate solutions suffice. When materials are insufficient, improvisation compensates. When doctrine fails, common sense prevails. This applied not just to wartime signals, but to post-war reconstruction, to economic challenges, to national identity. Bertie Marsh's contribution crystallized this principle. Extraordinary results emerge not from perfect preparation, but from ordinary people refusing to accept impossibility. The evacuation of Dunkirk, that miracle celebrated in Churchill's rhetoric, resulted not from miraculous intervention, but from thousands of small improvisations like Bertie's antenna, each individually insignificant, collectively transformative. The clerk from Bromley, who used a pencil to violate electromagnetic theory, represented something quintessentially British: stubborn practicality, confronting theoretical impossibility and, through sheer determination, making impossibility work. The wonky pencil antenna, structurally ridiculous and technically absurd, transmitted long enough and clearly enough to coordinate history's largest military evacuation. It proved that perfection matters less than persistence, that regulations matter less than results, that ordinary people with ordinary materials can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept defeat. In 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany with inadequate resources and insufficient preparation, this lesson wasn't merely historical footnote, it was national survival strategy. Bertie Marsh's improvised antenna embodied that strategy, insufficient by every measure except the one that mattered most. It worked. If this story of British ingenuity and wartime resilience moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. What other improvised solutions saved lives during the war? Share your family's stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another forgotten hero. Remember, history isn't just about grand strategies, it's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, just like Bertie Marsh.